Hello, wonderful people. I'm Dane Peterson from Wonderbot Animals, and here is... This man was suddenly stopped by a stranger while taking a walk. What followed will astound you. Before we begin, make sure to smash the like button, subscribe to our channel, and click the notification bell for more amazing videos. Mark White is a native of Michigan who lives with his two pooches named Belle and Crew. The dogs are adorable, and it goes without saying that Mark is truly enamored of them. Whenever he finds himself in stress, he spends time with his tiny pals by playing with them or taking them out for a walk, and then everything would fall in the right place for him. That particular day, the dog owner took his pups out for a walk in the neighborhood. Dogs love to go for a lengthy walk, even more when the weather is lovely and refreshing. The day driven by the chilled breeze and fluffy clouds are Pooch's paradise, and no tail wagger would want to stay inside their house on those tempting days. That goes for Mark's fur babies too. Belle and Crew would accompany their owner more than happily on walks. That day, the trio were trailing in the neighborhood, enjoying the pleasant weather when someone lunged over Mark. No, it was not some robber or a petty thief looking for money. The man who showed up suddenly before Mark was an elderly person. He must be over 60 and was behaving in a very strange way. He wanted to tell something, but words were not coming out of his mouth. Clearly, the fear of something had left him fumbling for words. Not only was he struggling with his words, but was also trying hard to hold back the tears that were about to trickle down his cheek any time. No, he wasn't mad, nor was he lost. The reason was something else. Mark, on the other side, remained perplexed by such a strange encounter. The appearance of the gray man itself explained that he was distressed, so in order to calm him down, Mark asked him to first sit calmly and take some breath to gain his composure back. Once the man managed to pull himself together, he began to share the cause of his weird behavior with Mark. The reason shook Mark as well. The stranger explained that he had come here for a walk with his 64-year-old wife, Terry Carl, when she suddenly disappeared. Since then, he had been looking for her everywhere, but could not succeed in locating her. The man pleaded White to help him in finding his wife as he was old and incapable of searching everywhere. You might be thinking, what is the big deal if she went somewhere? She would come back after a while. But mind you, Terry was not like other women. She was different, and her disappearance was indeed a very big deal. Terry was having a tough life as she was afflicted with dementia. The disease had left her disoriented and confused for the rest of her life. The man had to take extra care of his wife as she used to wander off anytime, anywhere. Caring for an ill person is not an easy thing, especially if it is an elderly person with dementia. Previously, he managed to find her out, but this time the woman had disappeared to some unknown place, and the gray man was too clueless to find her out. The disease had overpowered her completely. Dementia is a very severe disease that damages the thinking abilities of a patient, along with weakening their memory to a dangerous extent. These disabilities lead to delusion and behavioral issues. The problem does not end here. Often the afflicted people are easily prone to anger and wandering off. The illness not only affects the patient, but also the people who surround them. Those who take up the responsibility of caring for someone with dementia have to be on their toes. Such was the case with Terry that was going to unfold another thrilling event. First, let's find out why dementia patients wander off. The reason is going to break all the stereotypical tags attached to them. The big misconception revolving around dementia patients is that they wander off aimlessly. It may interest you to know that is not the actual reason. Some wander off while engaging in their old habit or routine. The other reason could be that they are confused or searching for someone. Lastly, some walk away only to get rid of the feeling of restlessness owing to the emotional disturbance and forget to come back. Unfortunately, how to stop dementia patients from wandering is still an insurmountable question, and the only way out is to stay around them round the clock. However, why Terry wandered off was still a mystery. Being a helpful guy as he was, White decided to help Mr. Carl. White recounts, "The gentleman came out and asked if I had seen his wife," he continued. "I was coming up Maple and said I'd be happy to look for her." He continued walking on his path, and this time with his eyes and ears open. They also inquired about the old lady to every person they came across. Unfortunately, no passerby could help. Dusk had fallen and Terry was still missing. With the increase in darkness, the anxiety of Mr. Carl also increased. It was a cold September, the night was approaching, which means it would be even more difficult to find Terry. Gradually, the darkness was dissolving into the surrounding that in result was hindering the vision of both the men looking for an old lady who herself perhaps did not know that she was lost. Beneath the hazy sky, White and the old man continued searching for Terry at every possible place. The evening was turning cold with every passing second. Despite the decreasing temperature, Mr. Carl's hands were sweating with worry. They did not have much time. They needed to find Terry before the night fell. Mark looked at each and every person passing by, but no one around looked even closer to the woman Mr. Carl had described. Getting no success in the park, he took to the streets with his dogs and started looking for her on the corner of streets. Sadly, there also he failed to track the woman. Now, there was no place left to look for. He gradually began to feel discouraged and thought they perhaps would never be able to find the woman. It was then something bizarre happened. White was already distressed at his failed attempts, and now his dogs had started behaving strangely. The pooches began to swing their tails fastly. But it wasn't time to get concerned over the dog's behavior. For now, the most important thing was to find the woman, and as he and Mr. Carl had failed to find her out on their own, they decided to do the next best thing. What do you think? Was Mark making a big mistake by ignoring his dog's strange behavior? Mark and Mr. Carl informed the police about the disappearance of the latter's wife. The police quickly made the announcement all over town so that more people could help in the search. Meanwhile, the complainants kept their search on. However, the missing report was yet to be filed. The cops' help did not seem to make much difference. While looking for Mrs. Carl, Mark with his dogs crossed a group of thick woods. It was then the obedient dogs became uncontrollable. They began to pull their leashes in a certain direction. Mark had never seen his dogs going so adamant. He sensed something wrong and decided to follow the hounds. Dogs are widely known for having a strong sixth sense. They easily can sense what we humans are not able to sense. For instance, dogs sense natural calamities way before humans realize. Along with that, dogs have a strong sense of smell. These qualities, added to their adorable appearance, makes them a perfect pet. Mark was a bit skeptical about his dog's behavior. It is important to point out here that dogs can easily be distracted by any sound. That is to say that the dogs can run after any animal sound. That is why Mark thought that perhaps he was walking up a blind alley. But that was not the case. The pups were behind something really important. Mark went past the busy streets only to enter into a dense jungle. He had no idea where his dogs were taking him. He followed them, patiently wading through the giant trees. His pups were taking him into the woods. No doubt, the forest was thick enough to hide everything in it but a shiny object. The thing was lying on the ground on the forest. On perceiving that, dogs rushed to the object only to find out more about it. What could that shiny object be? The object that the dogs and their owner took notice of was nothing but a pair of glasses. It was baffling as who would drop his or her glasses on the ground, and why would anyone come to this part of the woods without any purpose? Whose glasses could it be? Was it Mrs. Carl? If yes, then why did she throw her glasses on the ground? Had she been a victim of any wrongdoing? Mark needed to find the owner of the glasses as soon as possible. He did not know who could be the owner, but somewhere in the back of his mind, he was having the intuition that the spectacles belonged to Mrs. Terry. Perhaps she was in trouble and needed help. After all, she was not just old, but ill too, and completely unable to help herself out. The night seemed darker and cooler in the woods. Mark was shivering with cold and for once thought of turning back. But the thought soon got substituted by the thought of the frightened old man who was desperately looking for his better half. He had promised the help, so he needed to step further even if he did not want to. Unaware of the sight awaiting him in the middle of the jungle, Mark marched ahead with his pals. Mark had penetrated deep into the forest. Now the vision of Mark and his dogs heavily depended on the flashlight he was holding. He brandished his flashlight all around only to see if he could get any more clues. He inched further and the dogs once again began to behave weirdly. It seemed the dogs had found something. The dogs began to sniff something and prompted their speed. They began to run, and that made Mark quicken his pace. The dogs were now in control. It was now difficult for Mark to pace up with them. After running for a while, the dogs stopped at a clearing. Mark directed his flashlight towards the clearing and saw something there. His jaw dropped. The clearing was not empty. The place was occupied by a figure. On coming nearer, Mark realized that there was a woman sitting in the clearing. However, the woman was not making any movement. Naturally, he had many assumptions swirling in his mind. He continued walking towards the figure. The appearance of the woman in the clearing exactly matched the description given by Mr. Carl. Realization dawned on him. He was standing before Mrs. Carl. He called her by her name, and fortunately, she responded to that. However, she still looked perplexed. The woman was finally found, all thanks to Belle and crew. Mark had never felt so proud of his doggies. Why would he not be? The dogs had pulled a big task off without undergoing any police canine training. It was difficult for Mark to wait to tell Mr. Carl about his successful search. He helped the old woman get up and turned back toward the street where Mr. Carl was, hopelessly looking for his beloved wife. Mark and the old woman stepped towards the station to meet Mr. Carl and surprise him with this beautiful news. Little did they know, very shocking news was waiting for them at the station. They finally reached the station, but the environment there was not an ordinary one. There was an ambulance parked outside the station. Mark and Mrs. Carl went inside to find out what was the matter. They were shocked to see Mr. Carl lying on a bed. The ambulance standing outside had come for Mr. Carl. What really had happened in Mark's absence? Mr. Carl had been stricken with an anxiety attack. It was obvious that the attack was caused by the fear that he had developed after the disappearance of his wife. He had worn out after going from pillar to post in search of his wife, and so was excessively exhausted. As a result, he stopped breathing and collapsed. The ambulance was called in immediately, and Mr. Carl was taken to the hospital. It was to see how much the health of old Mr. Carl had deteriorated. The first thing doctors did was to aid Mr. Carl with a breathing monitor. It was an indeed strange day for Mark. After getting Mr. Carl into the hospital, Mark took Mrs. Carl to her home. She was still disoriented. Mrs. Carl was perfectly fine, and now it was Mr. Carl whose life was at stake. Mark decided to stay with Mrs. Carl in her home. You can never predict life. A few hours ago, Mark was on a casual walk with his two buddies, and now he was taking care of an old lady he was a complete stranger to some time ago. He was waiting impatiently for a phone call from the hospital. Mr. Carl was in critical condition owing to his aging body. He was taking a nap while waiting when a phone call jerked him out of his sleep. He rushed towards the phone and picked it up. It was from the hospital. His heart was racing as he did not know what the doctors were going to say. He said hello, and a reply came from another end that made him look towards Mrs. Carl, who was sleeping, unaware of all the happenings. The doctor told Mark that they successfully had restored the breath of Mr. Carl and he was recuperating fast. In all this, he nearly had forgotten his superheroes, Belle and crew. Everything was fine now. Mr. Carl was doing fine and is leading a healthy life with Mrs. Carl. Ron Moore, Wixom police chief, admired the efforts of the dogs and White. He said, "The officers were in the process of taking the police report when Terry Carl was ultimately found." The sheriff also expressed his amazement over the incident. He called it a great story. He also asserted the relationship the community shares with each other. He said it all happened because we value our partnership with our community. As far as those cute heroes are concerned, their dad rewarded them with many treats and love from Mr. Carl and every person who heard the story. Moore was highly impressed by the work of the dogs and praised their work in his tweet as, "Great job."